1994, Russian armored columns casually drove into the city of Grozny. No one could have even imagined that the next 60 hours would be pure hell, and that almost every single one of them would end up dead, wounded, or captured. We're going to show you exactly what happened, why it happened, and how horribly far it went for everyone involved. Okay, so to briefly guide you to that December 31st and the horror that was about to happen, just a bit of context so you'd understand why everything went the way it did. Chechnya was a small, semi-autonomous republic inside the Russian Federation, with a population of about 1 million people, and its capital was the city of Grozny, where a mix of ethnic Chechens and Russians had lived side by side for decades. But when the Soviet Union started falling apart in 1991, through years of complicated, blurred politics that we're not going to bother you with, as there mostly all lies in any country anyway, it came to the point where Chechnya declared its independence. They formed a national army, kept most of the weapons left over from the Soviet era, and logically, the Russian Federation didn't really appreciate this. There was a sort of standoff for 3 years between them, until 1994, when Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia at the time, decided that Dudayev, the president of Chechnya, had to go. So, to prevent the conflict from escalating into an open, full-scale war, they initially deployed a small proxy force intended to appear unofficial to enter Chechnya and remove Dudayev from power. But this wasn't the force that was about to enter Grozny on New Year's Eve. Somewhere around 2,000 fighters with about 40 T-72 tanks rolled across the border, supported from the air by helicopter gunships and fighter jets. However, the Chechens really didn't like the idea of their leader being overthrown, so they set up ambushes along the way and obliterated the Russian column. Over 20 tanks were knocked out, 150 soldiers killed, and most embarrassingly, Russian soldiers were captured and paraded on television for the whole world to see what they tried to do. The Russian leadership was far from pleased with this development, so they assembled an emergency meeting and decided to launch a full-scale military operation against Chechnya. Within 2 weeks of that decision, the invasion began on December 11th. But it would take another 3 weeks of advancing through the country before the forces finally reached the outskirts of Grozny on December 31st. Now, the majority of Russia's highest-ranking generals actually opposed this operation. Hundreds of officers and special forces units outright refused to participate and were arrested. But there was no going back now, and the force that was going in was frantically assembled from whatever units were available at the time. Soldiers were scraped together from a bunch of different units, and the state of the Russian army was only a shadow of its Soviet might. They were underfunded, undertrained, mostly young 18-year-old conscripts with just basic weapons training, thrown together with whatever equipment they could get their hands on. They mounted up on tanks and BMPs, where they didn't even have trained drivers in some cases, so officers had to drive. It was just a mess. Some tanks weren't issued ammo for their machine guns, and not to mention that there was no formal plan for how they were supposed to quote-unquote take the city in 2 hours, as the Russian president so confidently claimed. So fast forward to December 31st. 12 hours before New Year's, the brigade approached the city and stopped. They took up defensive positions and waited for further instructions. Soldiers were talking among themselves, wondering what was about to happen, and no one really knew anything, but they could suspect it. More experienced soldiers knew in their guts that something bad was coming, but no one could know just how bad. After just half an hour, they got the order to enter the city. The initial plan called for 4 armored columns to move into the city simultaneously from different directions and converge on the presidential palace in the center. But when they were actually ordered to move, only 2 of them were available. One brigade had been hit by friendly artillery fire and retreated, while one parachute regiment simply refused the orders to attack the city. So they were left with basically just the northern group, commanded by General Pulikovsky. That was the main assault force, roughly 2,700 men, about 100 BMPs, around 50 tanks spread across the 131st Mykop Brigade and the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. The whole idea was that a massive display of armored force rolling through the streets would make the Chechen defenders give up and surrender. But it turns out they had pretty different plans. And these two Russian formations were advancing on separate routes into the city, meaning they were too far apart to support each other in case of something like, say, a well-prepared and coordinated ambush from all sides. There were about 20 times more enemy fighters than intelligence had predicted. What could possibly go wrong? Now here's where you need to keep track of who is who, because two separate things were happening at the same time on two different routes. The 131st Mykop Brigade entered from the north, moving toward the railway station in the city center. They advanced in two assault groups about 20 minutes apart in long convoy formations, one vehicle behind the other, spaced just about 5 meters apart. Their objective, which they received over the radio, and keep in mind there were no written orders, was to take the railway station. On a separate, parallel route along Pervomaiskaya Street, the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment was also pushing into the center, heading for the square near the presidential palace. But here's the thing, the Chechens were actually caught off guard. They did expect the Russians to enter, but not in this outright suicidal way. They were literally shocked by how they just casually drove into the city, as if on parade. At the city entrance, someone had spray-painted a message in red on the sign, "Welcome to Hell." However, for the first 2 hours, there was no resistance at all. The streets were empty, no shots fired, no people anywhere. The city appeared completely deserted. But the strange thing was that everything else seemed normal. Streetlights were on, lights were glowing in apartment windows, and the deeper the columns went, the more confident the commanders became that this was going to be easy. By about 1 in the afternoon, the lead elements of the 131st Mykop Brigade, the first assault group, reached the Grozny railway station deep in the center of the city without encountering any resistance. However, unbeknownst to them for now, the station sat right between the outer and inner rings of the Chechen defense around the presidential palace, meaning the 131st had literally driven straight into the middle of the enemy's combat formations and parked there. They had Chechen fighters all around them, in front, behind, and on both sides, and they had absolutely no idea. They parked their tanks and armored vehicles in neat rows around the station and waited for further orders. Nobody secured the surrounding buildings. Nobody set up defensive positions. The infantry stayed inside their vehicles or went into the building of the railway station. At some point before the attack began, and the exact timing is debated, so we can't say for certain when, but it was shortly before everything went to hell. A Chechen commander, most widely identified as Turpal Ali Atgariev, got on the Russian radio frequency and contacted Colonel Ivan Savin, the commander of the 131st Brigade, directly. He called him by his nickname, Alik. It's said that they knew each other from their years in the Soviet military, and I'll put you the link to the whole conversation that you can listen to later. But Atgariev basically pleaded with Alik to give the order and get out of the city, and that he didn't want the bloodbath to happen. The conversation was friendly, with him trying to convince Alik to save his soldiers, as no one wanted this to happen. Colonel Savin said he understands, but that he couldn't give that order. He had his orders from above, and he would follow them. There was simply nothing he could do.
Алик, давай, может быть, как-нибудь, пока не поздно, отведите ребят, Алик, не делайте это, не делайте, не надо. Вы в любом случае, Алик, пойми, и ты погибнешь, и я погибну. Что с этого толку будет? Сам правильно пойми, кто от этого выиграет. Мы же от этого с тобой не выиграем, понимаешь? Если я тебя увижу в бою, понимаешь, что ты отлично, не отлично, уже я тебя сидеть не буду так же, как и ты меня, понимаешь? Ты лучше ко мне как гость приедали. Отводи ребят, не надо, пожалей их матерей, пожалей их самих, отводи ребят. Я не такой большой начальник, чтобы давать такие команды.
Savin wouldn't make it out of the city. Atgariev survived the battle, but was captured by Russian forces during the Second Chechen War and died in a Russian prison in 2002. Shortly after this conversation, a new message came through the Russian radio frequency, the same one written on the sign at the city entrance. "Welcome to Hell," and then Grozny exploded. In a coordinated assault, Chechen fighters who had been sitting silently in the buildings along Pervomaiskaya Street opened fire on the 81st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment first, as they were still driving toward the city center. RPGs destroyed the lead and rear vehicles of the column, boxing the remainder in between into a kill zone with no way out. The streets were too narrow to turn around, and tens of tanks and armored vehicles were stuck. Everything erupted with such speed that the Russians couldn't even respond. It just went to chaos. The 81st column was being